This is a passage from Men of Tomorrow by Jared Jones about Superman's creators and what happened. They had lawsuits earlier. It didn't go their way. And actually the sad fate of the creators, the writer and artist who created this icon that inspired so many of the other heroes. And here are some interesting passages. And you should know that Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz, those are like the big shots at the DC Comics back then. Writers and artists believe in an ownership that transcends money and contracts, but salesmen and accountants don't. Donenfeld and Leibowitz didn't draw, didn't write, didn't make things up out of their pain and dreams. They bought and sold. This goes on that basically they had hired a lawyer, Siegel and Shuster, and this lawyer maybe was on the take and DC bought him off, or maybe so he fumbled the case and they lost it. And I think maybe this lawyer got rich somehow. Maybe he got the payoff. Even though he was working for the Superman creators in court, maybe behind his back he took a DC payoff. Anyway, this is something you should know. The decision came down in May 1948. The court ruled that Siegel and Shuster had sold all their rights to Detective Comics Incorporated, meaning DC, and had no claims to Superman. It found no evidence of $5 million in damages. It did agree that their creation had been unfairly exploited with Superboy, and called for the parties to reach a settlement. Zug Smith quickly came back to Jerry and Joe with an offer. If they surrendered all claims to Superman and Superboy, they'd get a settlement from National for $100,000. Only that from a $1 billion creation, right? Jerry was in agony. The settlement, 1/50th of what they'd asked, would go mostly to Zug Smith's fees, meaning their lawyer. The money he and Joe would come away with wouldn't even equal a year's work for National, work they'd lost forever by suing. They had to keep fighting, but Zug Smith told them there was no point. He and Joe had better take their settlement instead of pouring more money down the drain and maybe coming up with even less. Joe reportedly didn't want to keep the fight going. Jerry finally agreed to cut his losses. He declined to file an appeal. Here's something interesting. 40 years later, off the record, Joe Shuster would voice the suspicion that had haunted him since 1948, that Albert Zug Smith had gone to Jack Leibowitz and said, "What will you give me to end this nuisance right now?" Meaning the court case. I think this passage really says it all. Joe Shuster disappears from the stories of the comic book industry, but for a pair of anecdotes passed among men in the business. In one, an artist sees him on a Central Park bench. He is so down and out that the artist buys him a sandwich, and Joe tells him how his life was ruined by the lawsuit against National. The artist asks if he can do anything for him, but Joe says no, thanks for the sandwich, and hobbles off. In the other, Joe is working as a delivery boy in Manhattan. One day he takes a package to National Periodical's offices. A couple of editors recognize him and engage him in a conversation. Just then, Jack Leibowitz appears in the lobby and tells everyone to get back to work. When Joe is gone, Leibowitz calls the delivery service and tells them never to send that man to their offices again. Where the story is true, Joe didn't like to relive the bad days, even during the later disputes with National, and avoided talking about whatever humiliations he had suffered. But he did take odd jobs to ease his brother's financial burden, and he did spend most of his days in solitude. True or not, the stories had power because of what Joe had come to signify. There could be no clearer symbol of the heartlessness and utter hopelessness of the business than the descent of the artistic creator of Superman into poverty. Telling stories about Joe Shuster was a way to say just how terrible the business and the owners were. It was also a way to tell yourself, at least I didn't fall that far. And here's something I didn't know. There was an editor called Mort Weisinger. He was the editor primarily of the whole Superman line, as well as other books at DC. He held a lot of power, this editor, back then. And he was a nasty son of a bitch. And downright cruel and mean. And others had to put up with him. And this is just an excerpt of what they had to put up with. And remind you that one of the creators of Superman, the writer, he was being bossed around by this editor on a character he created. And without the character he created, this editor wouldn't have controlling interest in the character to tell him what to do. And so you have this editor basically telling the creator of the character what you can do or you can't do. And he treated him badly. Weisinger was notorious for his treatment of freelancers. He would sit biliously behind his desk. Roy Thomas, his editorial assistant for 2 weeks, described him looking like a malevolent toad. and swear and bellow and laugh at his writers and artists. Alvin Schwartz, the poet who'd become the regular writer of the Superman newspaper strip, left comics entirely because Weisinger wore him down. Don Cameron, his other favorite writer, left him too, but not before, or at least so people said, grabbing him and holding him out an open window. He'd pound on you until he found your weakness, said Kurt Swan, Weisinger's main artist in the 1960s. Then he'd really go after you. Swan, who was famous for sweetness and affability, suffered disabling stomach pains whenever he'd have to deal with his editor. He found some relief only after he learned to yell back. Jerry Siegel couldn't yell back, or at least didn't believe he could. With Weisinger in front of him and the abyss behind him, he took whatever his one-time friend dished out. Swan knew that Weisinger praised Siegel's work in public, but whenever I went to the office and found Jerry there, Mort was berating him. Once, after reading a few pages of one of Siegel's stories, Weisinger stood up with the manuscript in his hand. "I have to go to the can," he said to Jerry. "Do you mind if I use your script to wipe my ass?" Weisinger was a liar, too. He had a trick to keep control in his hands. Jerry Siegel would come in and pitch a story about Lois Lane developing superpowers and realizing she didn't need Superman anymore. Weisinger would say, "That's shit, I've got a better idea." He'd send Siegel off to write a story about Superman joining the Legion of Superheroes in the future. Then Otto Binder would come in and pitch a story. Weisinger would say, "That's shit, I've got a better idea," and he'd send him to write his clever idea about Lois Lane developing superpowers and realizing she doesn't need Superman anymore. Later, of course, over gin rummy with Jack Leibowitz, he'd say, "Yeah, Siegel and Binder are giving me decent scripts, but I have to feed them all the fucking stories myself." He became obsessed with Superman, he said. He'd have nightmares about him. Several times he tried to quit, but Leibowitz would raise his salary. A golden cage, Weisinger called his job. Eventually, Leibowitz insisted he see a psychiatrist and offered to pay for it as a business expense. Weisinger said his psychiatrist told him he was identifying with his Man of Steel. If Superman lagged in quality or sales, he'd feel his own sense of invulnerability unraveling. Superman always had to lead the company in sales and fan mail, and he always had to be Mort's. Leibowitz finally intervened to talk Mort down. Maybe he did identify with his hero, but where his hero held it all together was physical power and condescending kindness, Mort held onto his power with cruelty. So there you have it. Interesting reading from the book. Basically, the Superman creators, they tried to sue DC Comics, and instead of settling or giving them something of a fair share, they gave them basically nothing, claimed the property as their own. The artist who designed or helped design Superman and gave you those first few issues and more pretty much went into poverty and despair, and the writer was basically treated like garbage by an editor, and both of them were just slowly thrown off the books. And meanwhile, the editors that I mentioned and the owners of DC back then, they were probably making something like multi-millions or close to it for owning Superman and working on the character, but they really couldn't bother or could care less about giving the creators any share at all. Unfortunately, I made another video about that personified Americana, and I think actually that this video is a personification of Americana's dark side, about corporations, about how you have creators, and the point I want to make in this video is that how you could have creators create something, whether it be art, music, or whatever, and then you have the business end, the people who control it, who don't make this thing, all they do is distribute it, and those distributors are the ones who end up rich, and the actual people who have creativity in many cases don't. And that is and that's a real topic to absorb, I think. And reading chapters like this really does personify the dark side. So that's it. Let me know what you think. Comment, subscribe, and talk to you later.